And the big top line picture is that there are going to be significant increases on taxation of the middle class. Number one, and the thing which we constantly campaign for, is tax the rich. Don't tax the workers, tax the super rich.
And I think that's a good idea. But it's also a good idea to have a sensible model to show what's going on. So by all means, as Gary says, focus on taxing the rich. Focus on the rich as well, but focus on the banks too and understand the financial system. Well, Gary Stevenson is a welcome addition to the economic debate in the UK and to some extent globally, because he's raising awareness about the major issue that most mainstream economists completely ignore, and that's the distribution of wealth and income in our modern economies. We have an extremely skewed distribution of income, worse than it was at any time in history, with the possible exception of what's called the Gilded Age, back in the end of the 19th century. So Gary is pushing that we should tax the rich, we must tax the rich, and here he's making a case that if we don't, there's going to be an economic catastrophe in a very short while. Let's have a listen, and I'll react at various points in his presentation.
Today, we are going to predict the UK budget 2.5 months in advance. If you are watching not from the UK, this is going to be very, very relevant for you as well. This year, I think something very, very interesting is going to happen in the UK budget, and I think it's important we get ahead of it. And the big top line picture is that there are going to be significant increases on taxation of the middle class. Number one, and the thing which we constantly campaign for, is tax the rich. Don't tax the workers, tax the super rich. These are the guys who have the assets now. These are the guys who have the government wealth now. These are the guys who have the working class wealth now and are getting the middle class wealth. This is what I constantly campaign for. You should tax the rich.
And I think that's a good idea. But it's also a good idea to have a sensible model to show what's going on. Let's just go back and take a look at when Gary's doing the mathematics here, or the arithmetic.
And we're going to use that through the example of an individual person, which is maybe not the perfect example, but I think it does describe what's happening, and it's important context for why the government is doing what it's doing now. Okay, so let's say, like the government in the post-war period, you start off with a lot of wealth. So let's say £1 million. Wealth income 50k, work income 50k, but your policy is you're going to run this wealth down. You're going to spend more than your income, so you're spending more. And then obviously the consequence of spending more than your income is that your wealth goes down. So next year you have only 900k wealth, less than $1 million.
Well, there's one little saying from a really fairly famous bloke called Albert Einstein, and he said, and that is, keep it as simple as possible, but no simpler. I'm sorry, but this is just too simple.
You can keep running this down and eventually you'll hit zero. Your work income is 50. But it's hard now, right? Because you're used to spending 200 a year. But we started to overspend even with no wealth left, and we started to run into debt. Then your wealth income can become negative. Like, not only do you have no wealth, but you have to pay interest on your debt to the rich. So now this is minus 25. If we keep lending these guys money, they're not going to be able to pay it back. This naivety to the aggressive falls in government wealth leads to a situation where obviously, inevitably, eventually you will run out of wealth and you will have to aggressively reduce your spending. Finally, with this choice that our UK government has now, your government will have very soon, which is you only have two options. Do you tax the rich or do you tax the middle class?
And I presume he did this with a spreadsheet first off. So I've made a little copy of the spreadsheet logic that he has to have here. And that's saying using initial wealth, it's this example of starting with £1 million, getting a 5% return, you're spending 50,000 a year, and you spend 200,000. So if you do that, you start with $1 million in wealth, you earn another 100,000, you spend 200,000, so that year you end up reducing your wealth by 100,000, and that's the fall of wealth shown over here. And then having got to the second year of the whole process, or the third year, you reduce your wealth by another 105, so you've got 795,684, which is the last figure that Gary wrote down there, and ultimately you end up with negative wealth, which is what he says we're heading for at some point. And I want to show what it looks like when you put it in a more sophisticated program, where you can actually model the flows that happen that are being ignored in this analysis. And that's my Ravel software here. And I'm going to reproduce the crisis that Gary sees coming in his spreadsheet example there. So we're going to start off with, I've got 1,600 inside there rather than 1 million, but that'll do for the moment. And what I have, first of all, the government spends on both the rich and the poor. I've got the government spending, say, 20% of its spending on the rich and 80% on the poor, which is reasonably accurate, but only taxing the poor. So the tax comes back from the poor. You've got tax the rich here as well, but that switch hasn't been clicked. So the tax burden on the rich is going to be zero when I start running this simulation. Now, one of the rules of government spending is that the government is required by laws, not by accounting, but by laws that have been passed by politicians, to issue bonds equivalent to the deficit, so the excess of spending over taxation income, plus interest on existing bonds. So that's another part of the program. I've done that. Having run a deficit, and I've got the government running, just up here I've got them spending 31% of GDP and taxing 30% back. So it's only a very small deficit on historical standards, 1% of GDP, but we'll see what happens to that anyway. So with that, it has to issue bonds equivalent to 1% of GDP initially, and then it's got to pay interest on those bonds, and that accumulates over time. And I can see the numbers here, so I can tell Ravel here to show me the numbers that are passing through the sheets there. So I turn that on, and now we can see that with this initial situation where the government is running a 1% of GDP deficit, then it's spending $992 per year out of a GDP of about 3,600, I think. And then that's 198 going on the rich, 794 on the poor. You're taxing the rich, the poor 960, taxing the rich 0. What's going to happen over time? You're spending less on the poor than you're taxing them. Their account's going to go down towards 0, and we'll see that happening. Equally over here, you're spending on the rich, but you're not taxing them, and you're then selling them bonds. Now, of course, that takes some money out of their account, but it gives them bonds on which they earn interest, so that actually helps their accounts accumulate over time. So let's run this model and see what happens. The red line is the poor, and it ain't long before the poor have got nothing at all, because they're being taxed more than they're having government spending going on them. The poor are broke. And that's the situation that Gary is saying we've already reached at the end of the current system. Well, let's now tax the rich. So I turn tax the rich on, I just recalculate there, and now you can see the rich are paying some tax. So it's still the same level of government spending at the start, 992 million or billion, whatever numbers you're working with, 800 on tax on the poor, but 160 on the rich, and then you're also selling bonds to them, so you just spend slightly more on them than you tax them, and then they buy bonds off you, but then you've got to start paying interest to them. So what happens now when you run this system? Oh, you see there's much less change in the amount of money in the accounts because you're not taking as much out of the poor accounts. You're taking a bit out of the rich, but you're putting more into them than you're taking out, initially because you're spending on them, but now because you're also paying them interest income. And notice what's happening, even though you're taxing the rich now, you still have an explosion in the level of government debt to GDP. So after 30 years, it's gone from 0 in this hypothetical example to 100% of GDP at 35 years, 120%. Interest payments are becoming impossible. At some stage, as Gary says in the video, the rich are going to say, this is a bad game, we're not going to continue playing this game, we won't buy your bonds, and bang, your economy is going to fall over. That's the crisis that Gary sees coming the way of the world, unless we do both taxing the rich and also get some back and stop running a deficit. But that has a strange effect here, because if you stop running the deficit, watch what happens. You're not giving as much money to the poor anymore, so they end up going bankrupt again. So austerity is going to mean a disaster no matter what. You might then try to spend a bit to try to come back into balance again. But it's a really difficult game, because as you do this, you're increasing the debt levels. We've already hit 2,000% of GDP. This is not a sustainable economy. But I've got some good news. This is not the economy we live in either. There's a big mistake being made here, and Gary is doing exactly the same thing that mainstream economists who don't worry about wealth as much as he does, he's making the same mistake they do, of thinking that the government is just like a household. And his example, in fact, was talking about an individual with that wealth and running it down. He's using exactly the same analogy for the government. And that is a mistake in terms of the structure of the financial system of every country on the planet. Notice what I've got here. This is seeing the banks as the avenue through which we distribute money around. And it's got the poor and the rich and the government all banking with the private banks. Now, the poor do, the rich do, as well as elsewhere, of course. The government, yes, it has some bank accounts there, but overwhelmingly it banks at the central bank, the Bank of England in the UK's case. Notice the debt doesn't turn up here. The reason for that is that the government debt in this vision of how the economy operates is owned by the rich. So you sell the bonds to the rich, that's happening here. You pay interest on the bonds to the rich. It doesn't go anywhere near the banks. Now, that's completely wrong. And this is a mistake. Gary's not the only one that makes it. Unfortunately, he's got a lot of company. Is that I've set exactly the same parameters into the system, but I've made the point that the government doesn't borrow from the non-bank public, it borrows from the banks. It sells the bonds. When the government initially issues bonds to cover its deficit, as it's required to by law, it sells those bonds in what's called the primary bond auction in America, or gilt auctions in the UK. And to be part of those auctions, you've got to either be a bank or have an account at the Bank of England to enable you to do the buying. You buy that at what we call reserve accounts. So the purchases, when they're made, run down the reserve account. So you run the reserves down, you get the bonds in return, and then the interest payments are made to the banks. And that's how banks do spending. You might notice, you might have missed it here, that I've got bank spending here, but I've got bank spending with no money in their bank account, so they don't spend anything. So all I've done is say, let's just shift things around a bit and say that in fact the banks are the ones who buy the bonds in the initial auctions. They're the ones who get the interest payments. They're the ones who spend. And I'm starting from the same point of view. No taxing of the rich, the spending fraction of GDP being 31%, so you've got a 1% of GDP deficit. Let's run this model and see what happens. And the rich end up being screwed, so the poor get screwed just as fast in this model. So another one of Gary's points, you've got to tax the rich as well. Well, let's turn on taxing the rich and start the whole thing over again. And again, notice we've got the same rough situation as you saw beforehand, the slow run down of the amount of money that the poor have in their bank accounts. Two things which are very different about this situation is, first of all, government debt's not rising anywhere near as quickly. In fact, you'll notice it's starting to taper. And then government interest payments are doing the same thing. And the reason that's happening is that the spending of the government is actually increasing the amount of money in the economy. This was left out of that simple spreadsheet that Gary put together, where there's just a certain amount of wealth and you spend it down, inevitably you're going to hit zero. But in the real world, and this is what we need to be thinking in terms of, not the toy models of mainstream economists, and Gary fundamentally is using the same model there. We want to model the real world. And in the real world, borrowing by firms from banks creates money. The government spending more than it takes back in taxation also creates money. So here I'm running this model for a longer period. And you can see the debt ratio is stabilised. There is no crisis. The interest payments have also stabilised. Again, no crisis. And even the poor now in this model, initially they saw the amount of money in their bank accounts going down. Now it's rising with the rest, even though the level of spending on them for a while was below the level of a taxation that was being applied to them. So by all means, as Gary says, focus on taxing the rich. Focus on the rich as well, but focus on the banks too and understand the financial system. And when you do that, you see, yes, you should tax the rich. That turned up in this model as well. But the main thing you have to be aware of is that government spending creates money. Now, obviously it's important to spend those things on sensible things like new roads, transportation system, schools, the national health system, not bombing other countries, which is a large way that the government does spend its money these days. That's what the government should be doing. So yes, by all means, join Gary in supporting the idea of taxing the wealthy. But Gary, join us in understanding the banking system and seeing that you don't face that catastrophe when you understand government finances properly.
Like many other truth seekers, I want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks. You'll love my new 7-week Ravel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com to apply as well for the 7-week Ravel Economist Challenge. Good luck.